I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. Today, we talk with Dr. Sarah Myhre. She's a public scholar, a climate scientist, and she's also one of the founding leaders of the Seattle branch of 500 Women Scientists. This was a really fun and important conversation for me. Dr. Myhre sees her work as a public scientist in a much broader context. She's an advocate for equality and diversity in science, and she's also a strong advocate for women's voices in science and in society as a whole. In fact, we talk about this in the context of how women's bodies, how we dress, our appearance, and even how much we weigh all play a role in our professional lives. Sarah's incredibly funny and she's engaging, which is really important given that one of her focuses as a public scientist is to improve science communication between scientists and the public. So without further ado, here is Dr. Sarah Myhre. Dr. Sarah Myhre, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
So why science? When did you decide to become a scientist?
Oh, gosh. I think I decided to pursue science when I realized that you could get paid to go scuba diving. So sometime as an undergraduate, I realized there was this job called underwater scientist or a field scientist that did scuba diving. So it was a very self-involved decision, I think, at that point. I really just wanted to see the world. I wanted to go places.
So you were still quite young, actually, when you shifted to climate science. So why climate science specifically?
Originally, I had taken a geology class as an undergrad, and it was sort of that classical rocks for jocks introduction into a very narrow field of geology, essentially. And I thought at the time, like, oh, this is not for me. I'm not into this. And it's funny how you make preconceived decisions about things. But then when I got my degree in biology and then spent a bunch of time underwater, and actually I spent like 1,000 hours underwater in both the Atlantic and then in the equatorial Pacific. And somewhere in the middle of the Pacific on a boat working for the federal government, I just had this realization that, these beautiful biological systems are so closely tied to the structure of this planet, the climate of this planet, and these big picture Earth systems around us. And I realized at the time, like, I was not prepared to understand those things. So I chose then to focus on going back to graduate school, which is where I then specialized in climate change and also in the ecology of marine ecosystems in the past.
So, back then, climate change, it wasn't a big headliner in the news, was it? I mean, there wasn't the same sense of urgency.
No, I think the pace and the tenor of the coverage on climate change has really changed in the last 10 years. This is about 10 years ago now. So, it was in the cultural milieu. It was absolutely being discussed, even up to pop culture. But things are different now. We've had enormous record-breaking events, global temperature events that I think have reframed some of the conversation.
In those early days when we all talked about climate change, the response was to, buy a Prius or to recycle. And that's all really useful. And those things are, really useful now. But I think things are more dire now. The landscape's changed a bit, no?
Yep, the landscape has changed and is going to continue to change. It's a brave new world for sure.
So let's talk a bit about being a woman in science. Was there a moment in college or later when you realized that your gender or being a woman would be a factor in navigating your career?
Actually, I would say that it was during fieldwork experiences as an undergrad where I realized that I was being invited or allowed into situations not because of my mind, but because of my sex appeal. And the interest in more senior men around me, kind of surrounding themselves with younger women for the ego, for the power dynamic of it. And I remember having a moment as an undergrad where I really saw that clearly and how that message of your brain is not as important as the currency of your body and the sexual appeal of your body to the male gaze. That sunk in real deep as an undergrad. So yeah, I could tell you story after story.
Right, that's really interesting. I haven't heard the phrase male gaze since reading Naomi Wolf, The Beauty Myth. But so you wrote something. Yep. You were a part of the science marches in Seattle. And you wrote about how the election changed something for you and how it showed you your obscene privilege, the obscene privilege that you carry. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I think this election helped me wake up to the nightmare of racial violence in this country, a nightmare that people of color have always experienced in this country that I, as a white woman, was able to engage with and then turn away from when I chose, because of the privilege of walking around in a white lady's body, with the privilege of having grown up with white families in Seattle, people that had access to education and many generations of upper middle class incomes. So, I mean, the election really broke a lot of things inside of me, and there's a lot of I'm thankful that I get to be here now and that I now can see things more clearly to learn how to show up for people of color and for racial violence and for social justice. So I'm doing that work right now. Like I'm trying to do that every day.
Right. Going back to your experience in school and the field work you were doing, thinking about the privilege, it sounds like you were kind of aware of a certain privilege that you had even then. Do you think that women in science who didn't have the benefit of youth or beauty were treated differently in those same circumstances?
Oh my God, absolutely. I mean, for example, I am 155 pounds right now. Like that's my weight. When I was like really pregnant, like I gained so much weight as a pregnant lady, right? And I gained like 70 pounds as a pregnant lady, and of course, that's not the experience of living in a body that is quote overweight, but it was like the empathic experience, the experience of realizing that the world looks at my body as a woman, and we are all partitioned into fine scale, gradients from skinny and the most valuable to overweight and the least valuable. Like, oh, it's a freaking nightmare, right? Our bodies as women are the primary currency for our professional and personal lives. And it's so rough, right? Because you can show up as a woman every damn day and be a dedicated professional and a loving person and a connected member of the community, and yet you still can't get your foot in the door or get as much attention from the power structure around you because you don't look a certain way in a certain kind of clothing. And it's challenging, right? There's some righteous anger around that I think women, that we just kind of live with.
That's interesting. I had a similar experience when I became pregnant. I gained 65 pounds. And it's interesting to live with the contradiction of, being aware enough to realize that you have a certain privilege, right? Understand how it's used unfairly in society, but then also to be put in a situation where you don't have control of it.
And a totally natural part of what we as women do in our lives. Like,
right.
Getting pregnant and gaining weight is so healthy and wonderful and appropriate and, completely normal. So, but yet the culture tells us as pregnant ladies, like, don't do that. You should be able to keep your bottom, real tight as a pregnant lady. And so the messages are just, they sink in really deep, and you have to work actively to separate yourself from the toxic aspects of the culture.
Right. But you can separate yourself, but it doesn't separate itself from you. People will still treat you in a certain way and judge you.
Indeed.
Yeah. And it was also interesting to learn just how fleeting that currency is, right? Just how precarious the currency that, women, can use at times and not use at other times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It costs you. Like, you don't see a lot of very femme scientists, right? We're out there. Right. In terms of gender expression, but I think, for example, I'll just use myself because I don't want to generalize. When I was in graduate school, I definitely did not femme up in the workplace. And yeah, I was at a laboratory, but even still, like, it was a sort of a distinct decision to kind of be more masculine in my appearance and fit in, basically, with the culture. And I think that piece, then I got married, I got divorced, which really was challenging and like introduced me to a whole nother level of sort of kind of coming to terms with your presentation in the world and women's lives in the world, because, a divorced woman is not viewed in the same way as a divorced man. And that was a very interesting and visceral experience. So anyway, on the other side of all that stuff, I've got my PhD, I'm divorced, so here I am in the middle of my life, and now much more confident and comfortable expressing feminine gender in the workplace. Like, it's who I am. It's the way that I want to walk through the world. And I feel much more powerful. Maybe it's because I now have my doctorate. Maybe it's just because I've grown up a little bit. Now, I love going to work and being feminine and sexy and feeling embodied and powerful.
Right. That's really interesting. It's that women, we're kind of stuck in this stance of being apologetic, whether we're too feminine or too sexy, or if we're not sexy enough. It's this constant state of trying to appease the watcher, the person who's judging us.
That's right. Yeah. And it's really complicated because, I know that I have, so here's the thing, my gender, I feel feminine in the world. I'm attracted to men. That's where I'm at. It's about sex, basically. And yet we also fem up for the supplication to the structure of male power around us. So as a woman who wants to be feminine in the world, but also doesn't want to undermine the women around me that are not feminine, and doesn't want to undermine the progress towards an equitable society, I need to look directly at how I use my feminine presentation to supplicate to male power. And that piece is I'm just learning, and I'm like that. I just cracked that door open recently and realized oh shit, I use pieces of feminine presentation in the world in ways that basically it's about using attention and getting power. And so there's another piece that's really complicated.
Right. Do you carry some guilt? I feel like I hear some guilt in your voice. Do you carry guilt over that?
Totally. I mean, there are so many ways that I have invested myself in the patriarchy and assumed a passive role in the patriarchy and in the racist society around us that I didn't at the time know that I was doing. I think you develop a critical eye, a deepening of self-awareness as you grow, especially when you're trying to grow out of a bubble of privilege. I think you really have to grow up in order to see your privilege more and ever more clearly. So yeah, I carry deep guilt around the way that I have walked through the world, but I'm also committed to the path. So I know moving forward, once you see things, you can't unsee them. So that at least helps me know I'm going to continually get better at this.
Right. You also refer to yourself as a loudmouth and a difficult, nasty woman, which is, one of the popular memes during the election. And, I've been thinking about that a lot, this kind of the nasty woman phrase or, label that we've taken on.
It's so grotesque.
It is, but, I think at the time,
yes, at the time, yeah,
it was empowering. It was the classic, take back something that was intended to be negative and use it and, take its power away. No, but I've been thinking about, the meme is still pretty popular, but does that mean,
The original use of it was grotesque, just to.
Right. The original use of it was grotesque and it was intended to have a different meaning, obviously. But I've been thinking a lot about our using it in this supposedly positive light. And if that means that we've lost the battle of being viewed in a negative light when we exhibit the same behaviors that men do. So if a man, if he's nasty, it's translated as tough. Right. If a woman is a loudmouth and a man, it's translated as assertive. By embracing those terms, Are we, throwing in the towel saying that we've lost this battle? We might as well allow people to paint us in this negative light, and then we will turn it around. Or maybe that will never happen.
I mean, maybe it's about embracing our righteous anger, and as women being able to look directly at this. Like, we need to advocate for our own voices. When I have been, for example, angry in public over public disrespect, in situations where a male colleague would be as well have his own right to his own anger, the anger of women is unpalatable in public. And yet we are angry for real reasons, for reasons that have righteous justice in mind regarding our lives, our voices, the role of women, equity. Like, oh my God, the voices of women are so important right now. There are many paths to this, right? I would never tell women, like, don't use the moniker of nasty woman, because there's a beauty in it, in reclaiming that space. But we all have to take, I think, individual different paths in order to get to that shared goal of raising our voices and honoring the experience of women of color, people that have been disenfranchised, the people that have been actively targeted and marginalized and harassed, people that are experiencing racial violence. I mean, yeah, I mean, that is such a key question, right? Like, how do we reclaim the strength of our voices when our bodies when we have been told by a man in the most powerful public office that our bodies are merely to be grabbed when available, to be assaulted and harassed at whim. So I don't know how to do this work very well. Like, I want to be a strong woman in public. I want to be professional. I want to serve the public with science and with evidence. And yet on the back end, like, I'm a woman, right? I have experienced sexual assault. I've experienced sexual violence. I've been sexually harassed in the workplace. Like, I don't always feel safe in the world. And that's because I walk around in the body of a woman and what we do to women's bodies in this culture. And so we live in this dichotomy as women, so vulnerable and yet trying to be strong and strong for the people around us.
Right. I was talking to Miriam Zringhalem. She's the head of the New York chapter of 500 Women Scientists, and you're the head here in Seattle. But yeah. I asked her that same I asked her that same question about, whether she felt safe, because both of you are in roles that have not been in a favorable light for this administration. You're women and you're scientists. And then her, on top of that, her parents were immigrants from Iran. And I can't imagine most groups feeling safe in the current political climate, right? Even if you aren't a woman of color, just being a woman in light of those Access Hollywood tapes and the things, the raw misogyny that we've heard since then, right? So it's interesting. We don't often say it out loud, but I think a lot of people feel unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think so. The experience of feeling unsafe through the election of Donald Trump and the rise of this anti-woman, anti-expert, anti-immigrant, anti-people of color hate rhetoric. I experienced that emotional wave, and I was talking to a colleague of mine, and she was so. I will always remember what she said, because she said, like, look, you don't feel safe, but think about all the people around you that never felt safe. Right? And extend yourself to the experience of the people that the election of this racist and the election of basically white power into the presidency was something that they might have anticipated because of their experience of racial violence. So that, that's a window into growth right there. And it's an opportunity for, all of us nice white ladies to get a grip and to extend ourselves into the experience of intersectional feminism and other marginalized people around us. So in some ways, this also has been a gift, right? This experience, because you get to grow when you get to see the world from with new eyes.
So what did the election change for you in terms of how you do your job? Because you've always been pretty comfortable in public, right? And you've been, very prolific and, give lots of talks. So what do you think shifted for you?
I am working nonstop right now. And the continuum between my work life and my activism, there's a lot of things across that continuum. One of the things that we've seen with the Trump administration is the devaluation of basic evidence and basic analytical, quantitative ways of measuring the world. As Katharine Hayhoe, a very famous climate communicator and climate scientist, says, a thermometer is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. And yet we see this deep partisan divide across basic evidence. We see complete circus demonstrations in the highest levels of the federal government, highlighting denialist and contrarian speech about climate. It's a crazy place to be in. And so being a woman aside, but being a physical scientist and someone who has studied the relationship between Earth systems, ecosystems, and human resources, we are courting a level of risk that is just, it is awful for us to be doing this as a society, as a culture. And we need to use evidence basically to back out of that scale of risk, right? To change the systems around us, to reduce the kind of risk that future generations will experience because of climate change. So, having an administration that doesn't value evidence, I think to me has just lit a fire under my backside regarding the importance of science and leadership in the culture, trying to show up for the importance of evidence for reducing risk and reducing cost for the public. It's so key right now.
Right. And I think that's one of the scariest things for me about the current political climate is this kind of post-rational world we're in. It goes beyond not trusting or dismissing expertise, but it goes a step beyond that. So I think what a portion of the electorate want, they actually want people who are not experts to become competent in a specific field. So it's beyond just not trusting expertise, but they specifically want to elect people who are not experts, then expect them to fix things that are broken. For instance, the director of HUD, who has absolutely no experience in urban development or housing, yet this is the person that we desire to run this office. Right?
It's crazy.
And I think that's even beyond not trusting experts.
It's just a travesty of appropriate investment. I mean, we pay these people's salary, right? We want them to be able to produce the highest quality of work. And the value of expertise means that we can solve problems more quickly, more cheaply. We can reduce the risk for people in cities, for food systems, for health systems, for our transportation system. I mean, these are all things that we want. We want to live in a society that is safe, that is inexpensive, that has options for, social mobility, where we have a robust middle class. This is good for everybody. This is about shared values. I share that outrage, right? And yet, part of the challenge is finding ways to talk to people about our shared values. Even if we come from, blue or red, deep blue and deep red demographics. So I am frustrated, but I want to shine that light back on myself and figure out what am I doing that sends a message that I don't respect people that don't hold my same worldview. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I do understand it. But the thing I think that is worrying that in some circles, if you walk into the room and you have the label on as scientist or expert, people will immediately certain people will just stop listening to you. And, I think that, scientists, generally are viewed as kind of smug and unapproachable. especially
Yeah,
in
we're
the
jerks.
topic of climate, especially with climate science, because the more critical things get, the more dire they get. Climate deniers are the left's favorite target, for ridicule. And it's kind of I was thinking about this earlier, it's kind of a form of bullying in a way, in that it reminds me of the classic scene you'd see in movies where you'd have this daft brute, knocking the nerd to the ground. And then the nerd's rebuttal is, insulting his intelligence. Right. Which is, I think, is, what we're doing on a certain level, which doesn't help anyone. It certainly doesn't help, people get on board to, fighting climate change.
No, that whole dynamic is really dysfunctional. That's why science communication is so important, because if scientists are going to show up to lead culturally, to lead institutions, to hold elective office, scientists need to be able to not show up in public and be this jerk, this isolated, ego, without empathy, without pluralism, without the capacity to know that, there are many ways of knowing the world, and science is one of them. And the human experience is bigger than just science. This is the opportunity cost of scientists in public showing up and essentially discrediting the broader field, right? And I've done this, and many of us have done this. Like, it is so easy to cost the community by not communicating clearly, or not representing yourself as a relatable human, someone who could be your neighbor. There's a lot of complexity inside of communication that is just sort of borne out in real time. You have to practice communication. You can't just write a manuscript. Well,
that isn't something that comes easily to a lot of people, but especially for scientists. I mean, they're kind of used to being around colleagues, their peers, who have as much information about their topic as they do, right? And there are very few people who are like yourself. Like, this seems to come naturally to you, your role as a public scientist and communicating with, outside of your comfort zone. But, there are very few people like you. If I were to go out and ask people, who's your favorite scientist, or name a scientist, they'd say Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye, those public celebrity scientists. But the average scientist doesn't have that charm and that appeal to reach a large group of people. And the problem is that when you have people who do have those skills, Neil deGrasse Tyson and Bill Nye, for instance, they often are in front of their own tribes, like people who don't need to be convinced that, climate change is real, right? And I'm not really sure if there's any value in that beyond entertainment.
I hear where you're coming from, right? So science comes across a whole continuum, right? Science is wonder, and it's magic, but it's real magic. It humbles us. It teaches us how beautiful the world is, how complex life is, how vast the universe is. Like, science keeps you up at night, right? It's amazing. But yet, on the other side of the continuum, science is over here, like, holding down the fort on public health, on goods and services and costs of our food system. Science is informing day-to-day granular decisions on city planning, on water quality, and everything in between, right? So yeah, science is entertainment, but then science is this practical, gritty, problem-solving, applied framework for essentially serving the public.
Yeah. Well, let's actually talk about some of the things that were recently in the headlines. So G20, when we did this recording, G20 was happening, and, we were publicly chided for leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. It's been about a month, I think, since we've been out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And basically the world was wagging their fingers at the U.S. for pulling out, which is a pretty embarrassing position to be in. But I think the thing that's not clear for me is the motivation behind pulling out of the agreement. Trump tweeted a lot before the election and years before, mocking climate change and, calling it a hoax. And since he's been elected, there's been silence. He's been kind of backtracking. And then, things switched, and then he just kind of pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, pulled that trigger that we didn't expect to happen. I'm struggling to understand the motivation behind this.
Oh, indeed. Myself as well. So many of the actions of the administration are just so incoherent and damage for damage's sake. I hate to think at some level, I think it's like a dog whistle for his base to again disenfranchise the US from a role in international leadership and to devalue the role of experts, and what to, I think, the right are touchstones of the left's agenda. At one point, I remember this statistic, but I'm going to cite something that I don't know where it came from. At one point, I was told that gay marriage and climate change were the two most controversial issues, the most polarized social issues in the United States. And so it's so challenging to have this very basic piece around the way that the Earth system functions being then forced into a partisan paradigm that it should never have been in the first place. It's not a Republican or a Democratic. This is about basic information, right? And we use partisan ideology as a lens. We shine that lens on information to decide policy solutions, policy levers. This is again where you get back to the physical science, the frustration of physical scientists, right? Because we can't make sense of it. It doesn't make sense, and it shouldn't be this way. And it's a political reality right now. This is why I think many scientists right now are becoming more and more socially and politically engaged, because it is so inappropriate for this basic evidence to be distorted in a partisan narrative.
Yeah. Right. And I don't see evidence that climate science has been politicized in any other Western nation or any nation in the way that it has in America. That part is kind of senseless to me. I don't understand how you could politicize fact, but we've managed to do it. But I think that you're right, that in part this is partly about, it's a dog whistle. It's also about his ego, right? He has been on the receiving end of ridicule about his intelligence, right? And about his competence. And, there's been some, assertions mm-hmm. that, he's done mm-hmm. the same thing in response to the Women's March, pulling support for Planned Parenthood, rolling out lots of, anti-reproductive services from women. And that's a revenge response for the Women's March. And, this could be similar.
It's funny. I have a toddler, and the caveman antics of a toddler are being borne out at the highest levels of the federal government right now. And the lack of emotional maturity that this man demonstrates in public is so baffling to me. And it is so frustrating because, you see women in public service, we have to toe every line of accountability and accuracy. Women pin themselves down in public service to the finest degree of accuracy and appropriate presentation of their expertise. And in order to walk that fine line, right? And yet we see a man in the highest level of public service, just this incoherent, tangled disaster of statements that conflict with each other, one position after the next, no center line, no depth underneath any of the policy frameworks that he presents, no accountability to past statements, and no transparency. No clear leveling with the public saying, I'm acting in your best interest. This is not normal. It's a stunning dystopian paradigm that we're living in right now.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think your comparison to a toddler is apt. And I think I made a conscious decision recently to not spend too much time analyzing mm-hmm. the behavior of a toddler, because you won't get very far, right? And right. At this juncture, yeah. I think one of the reasons why, I have the podcast is that I want to kind of move beyond, kind of step over the toddler.
That's right.
And go to solutions. But I feel like with climate change, pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement was so big, and it seems, insurmountable to me, that I'm struggling to find any answers. So there's some local governments and mayors that are committing to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think that's really helpful. But the problem is, I think that there have been fewer than 150 cities in the U.S. that have made this commitment. And that only represents less than a quarter of the impact that the U.S. as a whole would have on the climate. So
it's not enough.
I'm not really
it's
sure.
not enough.
Yeah, it's not enough, right?
Yep, it's not enough. And that reality was true, I think, before and after the Paris Agreement. So we have a lot of work to do. And yes, pulling out of the Paris Agreement fractures the landscape of leadership on climate action. And in some ways, that may be a good thing, and in other ways, it's a bad thing. The strength of American leadership at the highest levels of international agreement has been critical for us, for our economic growth, and for the currency of our nation on the international decision-making plane. That's how we grew out of the Second World War. It is a clear devaluation of our leadership. And I want to be clear how not normal that is and how important American leadership is. And yet, in this new state, with the fractured landscape of leadership, we now need to look to smaller units of decision making for that same kind of commitment and for the kind of sort of solution-based, engineering-based, creative ideas that will come out of a fractured landscape. So there's not one path towards the reduction of greenhouse gases. There are many, many paths. There are thousands of paths to get there. The problem is leadership. So, I mean, I think, that means, like, as citizens, our job is to show up right now and to show up for local politics and state level politics and to show up for our own decisions as consumers. There are a lot of ways that we can assume more responsibility as citizens.
Do you think that there is value in people pressuring their local politicians to declare solidarity with Paris, the Paris agreements? Like I said, it's only, I think, less than 150 cities have committed.
I absolutely do. And I think it's important for institutions like universities to commit to them. And I think it's important for business leaders to commit to them too. It behooves American business to align with the Paris Agreement and to ensure that the cost of climate change down the line can be reduced right now. So this is about business, absolutely. And this is about the economic interests that we have in maintaining the agricultural and transportation and the water resource structures that are already in place with the infrastructure in the United States. So there are the interests in aligning with climate change action cross so many different demographics: people of faith, business interests, outdoor recreationists, people in high latitude places, people in Alaska, people in equatorial places, people in like the equatorial Pacific and low-lying islands, people that live on coastal cities, people that live in the interior of continents, which will experience, which are likely to experience much more extreme heat and cold events. The risks of climate change actually unite us across so many different demographics. And essentially, if you live on planet Earth, you might want to get on this bandwagon because it behooves all of us to act collectively to prevent the kind of disruption to Earth systems that will come with unmitigated climate change.
It's interesting that you mentioned business. I'm curious to see what would happen if people voted with their wallets for companies that were not in support of climate change action. In the same way that people, stopped shopping at companies and retailers that were aligned with the Trump brands and Ivanka's, line of shoes and jewelry or, things that she sells. And, you saw companies moving away from those brands because the public spoke. And I think we haven't seen that kind of widespread activism towards companies who don't align with climate change action, right? And it would be interesting to see what would happen there. So there's a New York Magazine piece that got lots of attention, lots of headlines, and it was titled, "When Will Climate Change Make the Earth Too Hot for Humans?" And it was a pretty scary article. But the pieces that were done about this piece, many of them asked the question whether, the statement or whether the article was too dire, whether it was too scary. But, at this juncture, is there such a thing? Can you be too dire when you're talking about climate change?
I've been thinking about this dynamic, the dichotomy between, things are too, being scary and not being scary enough, being alarmed and not being an alarmist. And, one of the things I think we want to do is when we talk about this, when we're piecing apart, how do we do this work better? How do we talk about climate in public? And I think when people learn about climate change, there are a lot of really basal emotions that people experience that maybe you have experienced, that I definitely have experienced. Fear, guilt, anxiety, understanding that the way that I get around town in my Honda is contributing to this enormous global problem, along with me eating a hamburger, makes me feel a lot of unbidden emotions, right? Thinking about my kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest in a future of sea level rise and warming in Eastern Washington so that the Eastern Washington food system is destabilized, that gives me anxiety. So these basal emotions that come naturally, I have colleagues that are environmental psychologists, and I listen to them. And what I understand is that when people experience these kind of basal emotions, what happens is there's a cognitive disruption in that experience that prevents people from really looking at information directly, right? And so learning how to sit with those emotions and to vent those emotions and to acknowledge those emotions is one of the pathways towards reducing the anxiety around the conversation and getting us down to the ground and saying, yeah, like this is uncomfortable. No one wants this. And yet, because this is so uncomfortable and so frightening, frankly, we need to look directly at this in a practical way. To do the work, like I got my doctorate on this stuff. Like I thought about this for 6 years, and I martyred myself on this information. I was scared all the time, frankly, as a doctoral student, about the scale of the changes, the risks that come, the importance of our connection to a living planet. These are really big pieces, and it's understandable that people are scared by them. But we still need to function through those emotions, and we need to help people around us arrive at a safe place through the process of learning about climate change. For example, what happens in a lot of classroom settings, this is what I see. Okay, so, climate change is a global scale crisis that is going to impact every living animal and ecosystem and every person that ever lives on this planet from now into the future permanently. And we don't have scalable solutions at this moment. It's a global scale crisis. And we'll see you on Monday for the next test. Do you know what I mean? Like there's no welcoming people to process that information in a way that actually is a very human and emotionally intelligent way. We need to give students an opportunity to say, wait a second, what does this mean? And what does this mean to my friend and my colleague? And how do I integrate this information in a compassionate, safe space, in a way that is emotionally intelligent about processing the scale of information that comes with climate change? So we can do this work better.
Right. I actually didn't realize that there was a field of environmental psychology, which is really needed right now for everyone.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Thinking about how people think about these problems, what happens in the brain when you think about big problems, when you experience different kinds of emotions, all of those things can actually be really helpful as a climate communicator and as just a human being, like learning how we as humans deal with discomfort. For a long time, as a perfectionist, as a scientist, I had this idea like, I'm going to win at life as long as I, just keep making the quote unquote right decision. I won't feel those difficult feelings. I won't have loss. And then, the real part of human life happens. Death and divorce and change happen regardless of whether you make good or bad decisions. And so how you grow through those experiences of loss, how you sit with loss, how it can teach you about who you are and what you want in this world and where your values are, those are all the real rich pieces around, getting older and growing up and actually bringing your best self to your professional life is also sort of tied in all of that.
And so what's your ask of other scientists?
Well, I think on the short term, I think scientists need to show up for racial justice and racial violence. But in the acute, the real heartbeat of the need of the nation right now is ensuring that our colleagues, people of color, are safe and that their lives are valued by the state in the same way that the lives of any of my white colleagues would be valued. So that I think that that's the entry point right now. But I think on a longer term vision around seeing our careers as scientists in the way that we interface with the rest of the world, I would say that scientists need to speak with the public about the scale of risk that is coming, and scientists need to risk steps of professional advancement in order to speak truth in public. And we as scientists, we need to see that now is the time. This is the window where we get in front of this freight train, and it is worth it to do the right thing. It may not be the easy thing, but it is the right thing. And our bubble of middle-class American privilege is going to pop in a future of unchecked climate warming. And there are a lot of very motivating reasons right now for scientists to be loud, be uncompromising in their agenda around social justice and equity and the value of the lives of people of color, and uncompromising in their presentation of the importance of climate action at local, state, federal, and international levels.
Stephen Hawking, he just did an interview with BBC, and he said that we're closing in on the tipping point where global warming becomes irreversible. Mm-hmm. But he said that climate change is one of the great dangers we face, and it's one we can prevent if we act now. What does he mean if we act now? What can we do?
I don't really know where his statement is coming from on that. I don't know. That's a very quixotic statement because, yes, the actions that we take right now, they matter a lot. The kinds of decisions that we make in the next 20 to 50 years will shape the trajectory of the planet moving forward on a geological time frame. We have already altered the planet on a scale that will change the planet's trajectory moving forward for thousands to tens of thousands of years. So things are going to be different. The question is how different and how expensive. What's the cost? So I agree, Stephen Hawking, this is an enormous challenge. But think about, just to reframe it, think about we're living in the future, right? That this is a science fiction fantasy that is playing out in front of us. And think about the things that science has done, and think about the progress that we've made in social justice and equity. We are on the path, right? We have the tools in the toolbox to solve these problems. And there is a road forward for the preservation of the things that we value the most, and for the conservative approach towards mitigating risk and cost. So this is not about doomsday. This is about showing up in the 21st century and actually being an adult in the 21st century and realizing, if I have the privilege of having a computer in my back pocket, I also have the responsibility of understanding my role in this complex global system and showing up for social justice and climate action.
I was partly asking that question for myself because I hear it pretty often. People say, we must act now. And I just don't know. And then they stop. And and then I don't know what to do. And it's like, yes, I'm ready to act. Please tell me what to do. And then, the article ends, the interview ends. But
right. There's a hollowness to that, right? Because what do we do? And that goes back to there's 1,000 ways to get there. And there are ways at all levels of sort of individual and then collective organization. But change is uncomfortable, right? And change requires some level of self-critical evaluation. And change means holding people in power accountable. All of that is hard, and it takes time, and it takes the kind of discipline and commitment that is required of an adult life. And so that's why this is so hard, because it pushes on all these buttons, and it requires us to grow up, and it requires us to not only value our immediate satisfaction, but to value the lives of our neighbors and people around the world, and to value the lives of people that are going to be born in future generations. And so there's a bigness to it. There's a wholeheartedness to it that is required to stay in this fight. And it's worth it. It is so worth it, because, growing your heart and growing your capacity to show up for really big problems, it only gives back that kind of satisfaction of a life that has meaning, and that the work that you do is important, and that every little thing is actually matters. So, I think for me, I've gotten a lot of traction as a person in trying to show up for larger problems and for the lives of other people.
Dr. Sarah Myhre, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you so much. This has been a really great conversation.